The Pennsylvania frontier in the deep winter of 1720 was a world rendered in monochrome. White snow, black timber, and the leaden gray of a sky that promised more storm. The small, isolated community of Providence was a handful of log cabins huddled around a meeting house, a precarious outpost of faith and fellowship in an immense, silent wilderness. It was a community founded on Puritan principles, where every event was seen as a sign of God's favor or wrath. They were a people who believed in visible saints and undeniable demons. It was the trapper Ezekiel Miller, a man more comfortable with the company of trees than of men, who found the child. He was checking his lines a day's walk from Providence, in a part of the forest the Lenape called Tahalung, the Silent Woods, a place even they avoided. There, in a small clearing where the snow was untrodden by any animal, sat a boy. He appeared to be no more than 4 or 5 years old. He was naked, yet his skin showed no sign of frostbite or goose flesh. He did not shiver, he simply sat, perfectly still in the heart of that impossible cold. Around him, the snow was melted in a perfect circle, as if he generated his own warmth. Most shocking of all was his face. It was not disfigured, but utterly, profoundly blank. Where there should be eyes, a nose, a mouth, there was only smooth, unblemished skin, like a sculptor's clay before the work has begun. Ezekiel, a man of few words and deep superstition, felt a primal fear grip him. This was no lost child. This was something else. But his Christian duty, beaten into him since childhood, overrode his instinct to flee. He wrapped the boy in his own wolfskin coat. The child did not resist. He did not make a sound. He offered no weight in Ezekiel's arms, as if he were made of nothing but air and intention. The trapper carried his terrifying discovery back to Providence, a seed of horror carefully swaddled in fur. A child with no face has been found in the deepest, most silent part of the woods, a place even the native people fear. Brought to the isolated village of Providence, the foundling is a living paradox, a blank slate upon which the community will project its deepest fears and fervent hopes. Is he a miracle, a demon, or something entirely other? The arrival of the faceless child is about to shatter the fragile peace of this pious community. To follow the terrifying events that unfold from this moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a moment of this chilling chronicle. The arrival of the faceless child, as he was immediately dubbed, sent ripples of shock and fervent debate through Providence. The community gathered in the meeting house, their breath misting in the cold air, their faces a mixture of awe and terror as they looked upon the boy, who sat silently on a bench wrapped in Ezekiel's coat. Reverend Josiah Parris, a man whose faith was as hard and unyielding as the winter ground, saw a test from God. "Behold," he thundered, his voice echoing in the cramped space, "a soul untouched by the world, unmarked by sin, a vessel waiting to be filled with the grace of our Lord. This is a sign, a blessing. We shall raise him in the light, and he shall be our Samuel, a prophet for this new Canaan." He named the child Silas, meaning asked for, from God. But others were not so sure. Goodwife Prudence Alder, the village's sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued midwife, saw an abomination. "It is a devil's trick," she hissed to her neighbors. "No child of God is born without his image. That thing has no face because it has no soul. It is a hollow thing, a lure from the dark woods to lead us into sin and despair." She saw the child not as a blank slate, but as a void, an emptiness that threatened to swallow them all.
The child was given to Abigail and Thomas Miller, a devout and childless couple, to raise. They took him in with a mixture of terror and holy obligation, seeing it as their divine duty. The boy, Silas, never cried. He never laughed. He ate what was given to him, but seemed to derive no nourishment from it. He did not sleep, but would sit or stand motionless through the night, his featureless head turned toward whoever was in the room. He was a passive, silent presence, a mirror that reflected only the fears and hopes of those who looked upon him. The first to really look was Thomas Miller. One evening, as he knelt to say prayers with the boy, he found himself staring into that smooth, blank space where eyes should be. He saw nothing, but felt a profound, pulling emptiness, a vertigo of the soul. He broke off his prayer, his heart hammering. He told Abigail he felt a chill, but said nothing more. 3 days later, Thomas Miller was found dead at the edge of the forest, his face locked in a silent scream, his own hunting knife in his hand. The official cause was a tragic accident, but a whisper began. He had looked into the void, and the void had looked back. The village of Providence is torn between reverence and terror for the faceless child. The pious see a divine vessel, the fearful see a demonic trick. The first death, that of his foster father Thomas Miller, has cast a long shadow. Was it mere an accident, or the first fulfillment of a terrible curse? The child, Silas, remains a silent, unreadable enigma at the center of a growing storm. What happens when fear begins to outweigh faith? And who will be the next to meet a tragic end after meeting the gaze of the faceless boy? The horror is just beginning. To witness the escalating terror, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The death of Thomas Miller, while officially an accident, festered in the mind of goodwife Prudence Alder. She saw it as a confirmation of all her fears. The devil's child had claimed its first soul. She became obsessed, watching the Miller cabin from a distance, her knitting needles clicking like anxious insects, her eyes narrowed with righteous certainty. She began a campaign of quiet persuasion, gathering a faction of villagers who shared her dread. "It does not eat, it does not sleep," she would whisper at the well. "It is a mimicry of life, not life itself, and it will be the death of us all." Her moment of confrontation came on a bright, cold morning. Abigail Miller, now a widow living in a state of nervous exhaustion with her silent charge, had left the boy sitting on the stoop of her cabin to fetch water. Prudence Alder saw her chance. She marched across the common, her back straight, her mouth a thin, determined line. She would face this evil down. She would prove its nature. She stood before the boy, Silas, who sat motionless on the step. "I know what you are," she spat, her voice low and venomous. "Demon, changeling, I cast you out in the name of the Lord." The boy's smooth, blank head tilted up toward the sound of her voice. It was not a human gesture. It was the movement of a machine, precise and emotionless. Prudence, defiant, leaned in close, staring directly into the featureless plane of his face. She wanted to see the evil. She wanted to confront it. And in that smooth expanse, she did not see a demon. She saw nothing. But she felt everything. It was as if a trap-door had opened in her mind and she was falling into a vast, lightless, soundless cavern. It was the emptiness of a universe without God, without love, without meaning. It was the absolute zero of existential despair. She saw the utter insignificance of her life, her faith, her community. It was a truth so horrifying,
so fundamentally shattering that the human mind could not contain it. She did not scream. She took a single stumbling step back, her eyes wide with an insight too terrible to bear. She turned and walked slowly to her own cottage, next to the meeting house. She entered, closed the door, and was not seen again until the next morning, when a neighbor found her. She was seated in her rocking chair, her knitting in her lap. Her eyes were open, but they saw nothing. Her mind had simply broken. She was alive, but vacant, a hollow shell. The village physician called it a sudden apoplexy of the brain. But everyone knew. Goodwife Alder had looked into the face of the faceless child and had seen the abyss, and the abyss had swallowed her whole. The second victim has fallen, not to a physical death, but to a fate perhaps worse, a living death of the mind. Goodwife Alder's catatonia is a terror that cannot be dismissed. The curse of the faceless child is no longer a whisper, it is a scream. The village is now gripped by a palpable, paralyzing fear. How does a community function when a single silent child can annihilate a person's soul with a look? The fragile coalition between faith and fear is about to shatter, and the hunt for a solution will begin. To see how Providence turns from sanctuary to inquisition, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The catatonia of Goodwife Alder broke the community of Providence in two. Reverend Parris's faction, though shaken, held fast to their belief. He preached that the child was a test of their faith, that the deaths and the madness were the work of Satan, who was trying to make them reject God's miracle. "We must pray harder," he implored from the pulpit. "We must show the devil that our faith in this innocent soul is unshakable." To him, the child's very blankness was proof of its purity, a soul awaiting God's inscription. But the larger part of the village now sided with the silent testimony of Goodwife Alder. Led by Constable Jeremiah Black, a pragmatic and brave man who had seen the horrors of the frontier, they demanded action. "Innocence does not bring death, Reverend," Black argued at a tense town meeting. "Madness does not spring from holiness. That child is a plague, a poison. It must be removed from our midst. For the safety of every soul here, it must be returned to the woods from whence it came." Abigail Miller, caught in the middle, was a ghost of her former self. She lived in constant terror of the silent child in her home. She could not bring herself to look at him directly, tending to him with averted eyes, her hands trembling. She had loved the idea of a child, but this thing, this void in the shape of a boy, had destroyed her husband and shattered her peace. She secretly wished for Constable Black to take him away. The confrontation came to a head 1 week after Goodwife Alder's collapse. A group of men, led by Constable Black, approached the Miller cabin. Reverend Parris and his deacons stood in their path, Bibles in hand. "You will not take the Lord's chosen," Parris declared. "We are taking a danger to this community, Reverend," Black replied, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Step aside." The two groups stood facing each other in the frozen mud of the common, a physical manifestation of the ideological war tearing Providence apart. It was no longer about a child, it was about the nature of God, the limits of faith, and the primal instinct for survival. The standoff was broken by a sound from the cabin, a single, clear, high note. It was the first sound anyone had ever heard the faceless child make. It was not a cry, not a word. It was a pure, piercing tone, like a crystal glass struck by a needle. It hung in the cold air for a moment, and then stopped. In the silence that followed, every man, whether for or against the child, felt a cold finger of dread trace its way down his spine.
The village of Providence stands on the brink of civil war, divided by the silent, faceless child in their midst. The first sound the child has ever uttered has frozen both sides in a moment of shared primal fear. What does this sound mean? Is it a warning? A signal? The fragile truce is broken, and the next move will determine the fate of everyone in Providence. Will faith or fear prevail? And what will the child do next? The terrifying answer is coming. To witness the shocking escalation, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The single crystalline note from the faceless child acted like a spell. The tension between the two factions dissolved, replaced by a unified, bewildered terror. The sound had been utterly alien, devoid of any human emotion or origin. It was the sound of the void given voice. Men from both sides backed away from the Miller cabin, their argument forgotten. Reverend Parris looked uncertain for the first time, his Bible feeling suddenly flimsy and inadequate in his hands. Constable Black simply stared at the cabin door, his pragmatic mind unable to categorize what he had just heard. That night, the sounds began in earnest. It started as a low humming, barely audible, that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the cabins closest to the Millers. Then it grew, a dissonant chorus of those same crystalline notes, weaving together in a melody that was achingly beautiful and profoundly wrong. It was music from a world without light, a symphony of emptiness. The sound seeped into dreams, turning them into nightmares of falling through infinite space. It frayed nerves and shortened tempers. Children woke up screaming, and strong men found themselves weeping for reasons they could not name. The next victim was not claimed by a direct look, but by the sound itself. Samuel Gray, the village's young schoolmaster, a man of logic and reason, became obsessed with the phenomenon. He sat by his window night after night, a journal in his lap, trying to transcribe the impossible music, to find a pattern, a logic to the horror. He believed he could understand it, that he could master it with his intellect. One morning, he was found by his students. He had used the ink from his bottle to cover every surface of his small schoolhouse, the walls, the desks, the floor, with a single, endlessly repeated frantic scrawl. It is empty. It is all empty. He was gone, his tracks leading into the forest. He was never seen again. The music had not broken his mind like Goodwife Alder's. It had filled it with a truth it could not hold, driving him into the welcoming silence of the wilderness. The faceless child was no longer a passive recipient of gazes. It was now an active source of a psychic plague, broadcasting a symphony of despair that is driving the villagers to madness and suicide. The curse is airborne, seeping into the very soul of Providence. How can the village fight an enemy that attacks through sound and thought? With faith broken and reason useless, what desperate measures will the survivors take? The community is nearing its breaking point. To see what happens when terrified people are pushed beyond the edge of sanity, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The disappearance of Schoolmaster Gray was the final straw. The collective sanity of Providence snapped. The eerie, dissonant music from the Miller cabin was a constant torment, a needle drilling into the mind of the village. Sleep became impossible. Paranoia flourished. Neighbors began to look at each other with suspicion, wondering if the emptiness they saw in each other's eyes was a reflection of the child's influence. A mass exodus began. It was not organized, it was a rout. Families packed what they could carry in the dead of night and fled, abandoning their homes, their livestock, their fields. They chose the tangible dangers of the winter wilderness, starvation, exposure, wolves, over the psychological annihilation that waited in Providence. They did not look back. Within a week, the population of the village was halved. Those who remained were the utterly devout, led by Reverend Paris, who saw the flight of the others as a failure of faith, and those who were simply too old, too sick, or too broken to leave. Constable Jeremiah Black was among those who stayed, but his duty had transformed. It was no longer about keeping the peace between men, but about containing the horror. He saw that the child was a contagion, and the village was the infected tissue. He proposed a final grim solution to Reverend Paris and the remaining elders. The Miller cabin must be sealed, with the child and Abigail Miller inside. It was the only way to quarantine the plague. Reverend Paris was horrified. You would murder an innocent woman and a child of God. There is no innocence in that cabin, Reverend, and that is no child. It is a pestilence. Abigail is already lost. We are saving what is left of our souls by containing it. The argument that followed was the most terrible in the village's short history. It ended when a scream tore through the air. Not the child's alien music, but a human scream of pure, unadulterated terror. It came from the Miller cabin. When Black and the others forced the door open, they found Abigail Miller on the floor, alive, but her face was a mask of such profound horror that it was unrecognizable. She was staring at the far wall where the faceless child stood. She had finally, truly looked. Her mind had been scoured clean, leaving only the fossil of her final, silent scream. The decision was made for them. Providence has been destroyed. Most of its inhabitants have fled into the deadly wilderness, preferring a physical death to a spiritual one. Those who remain are faced with an unimaginable choice: commit a terrible act to contain an unspeakable evil. The fate of Abigail Miller has decided the matter. The time for debate is over. The time for action, however horrific, has come. What does it mean to seal a living horror inside a cabin? And can simple wood and nail truly contain a force that can shatter minds with a sound? The final desperate act of containment is about to begin. To witness the terrifying climax, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
They worked with a frantic, silent efficiency, their breath pluming in the freezing air, their hammers sounding like a death knell. Constable Black, Reverend Paris, and the 3 other remaining men nailed heavy planks across the door and windows of the Miller cabin. From inside, there was no sound, no protest from Abigail, no unearthly music from the child. The silence was more frightening than any noise. It felt like the calm at the center of a storm, a predatory patience. As the last nail was driven home, sealing the cabin into a dark, airtight tomb, Reverend Paris fell to his knees in the snow, weeping and praying for forgiveness. He had participated in an act he believed was a mortal sin, all in the name of saving the last flicker of his community. Constable Black felt no such conflict. He felt only a cold, grim satisfaction. He had done a terrible thing, but it was a surgeon's cut, necessary to save the body. He posted a watch, 2 men at a time, to ensure no one tried to break the seal, and to listen for any sign that the containment had failed. For 3 days, there was nothing. The silence from the cabin was absolute. The oppressive dread that had hung over Providence seemed to lessen, as if the poison was indeed being contained. The remaining villagers began to dare to hope. On the 4th night, the 2 men on watch, Ezekiel Miller, the trapper who had found the child, and Deacon Hale, heard a new sound. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching. It came from the other side of the sealed door. It was the sound of a single fingernail, dragging itself slowly, deliberately, across the inner surface of the wood. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was not a frantic attempt to escape. It was a signal, a mockery. It went on for an hour, then stopped. The next night, it returned, and the night after that. It became a new torture, a metronome counting down the seconds of their sanity. Ezekiel, the hardened woodsman, could take it no longer. On the fifth night, he pressed his eye to a crack between the planks, desperate to see the source of the sound. He saw only darkness, but he felt it, the same pulling emptiness that had claimed Thomas Miller and Abigail. He jerked back, but it was too late. He did not die or go mad. He simply stood up, walked away from his post, and kept walking, past the edge of the village, into the forest, never to return. He had been called, and he had answered. The child was not contained. It was merely changing its methods. The ceiling of the cabin has failed to contain the horror. The faceless child has found a new way to reach out, a simple, maddening scratch that is slowly dismantling the will of those who remain. It has claimed its finder, Ezekiel Miller, not through death, but through a silent, compelling call. The prison has become a pulpit, and the child is now preaching its gospel of emptiness directly to the souls of its jailers. How long can the last few people in Providence withstand this psychological assault? And what is the child's ultimate goal? The final act of the tragedy is at hand. To see how the story of Providence reaches its terrifying conclusion, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The defection of Ezekiel Miller broke the spirit of the remaining villagers. Deacon Hale, after hearing the scratching alone for one more night, simply vanished, likely following the trapper into the woods. That left only three: Reverend Parris, Constable Black, and a young, simple-minded man named Caleb, who did not have the wit to understand the danger, only the instinct to follow. Reverend Parris's faith, once an iron rod, was now a splintered wreck. He had sealed a woman and a child to die. He had presided over the destruction of his flock. He had prayed until his voice was raw, and God had answered only with silence, or worse, with the mocking scratch from the sealed cabin. He began to believe that Goodwife Alder had been right all along. The child was not of God, but a demon so powerful it could mimic divinity, and he, Josiah Parris, had been its greatest dupe. Driven by a final, desperate need for certainty, he approached the sealed cabin one afternoon. Constable Black, seeing the wild look in his eyes, tried to hold him back. "Don't, Reverend, it's what it wants." "I must know," Parris screamed, shoving Black aside. "I must see the face of the enemy I have worshipped." He tore at the planks on the main window with his bare hands, his fingers bleeding, splinters digging deep into his flesh. He managed to pry one board loose, creating a narrow slit. He pressed his face to the opening, peering into the darkness inside. The scratching had stopped. The cabin was silent. And then, in the gloom, he saw it. The faceless child was standing just on the other side of the window, its blank head level with his own. It had been waiting for him. Their gazes met. The Reverend did not see emptiness this time. He saw a reflection. In that smooth, featureless plane, he saw his own face, but twisted by pride, ambition, and a faith that was really a hunger for power. He saw how he had used the child to bolster his own authority, how he had willingly blinded himself to the suffering it caused. He saw the vanity of every prayer, the hypocrisy of every sermon. The child was a mirror, and it showed him the hollow man he had always been. The truth was more than he could bear. He did not go catatonic like Goodwife Older. He did not run into the woods like Ezekiel. He fell to his knees, and a single wrenching sob tore from his chest. Then he began to pray. But it was not a prayer to God. It was a prayer to the child, to the void, begging for forgiveness, for meaning, for an end. He prayed until his voice gave out, and then he continued to pray in silence, his lips moving soundlessly, his eyes fixed on the crack in the window, until he died of exposure and a broken heart in the snow. The faceless child had given its most devout follower the one thing it offered, the devastating truth of its own nothingness. The Reverend Paris is dead, his faith annihilated by the ultimate revelation of his own spiritual emptiness. The faceless child does not kill, it reveals, and the revelation is fatal. With the Reverend gone, only Constable Black and the simpleton Caleb remain. The village of Providence is a ghost town. Its story is nearly over. What final confrontation awaits the pragmatic constable, and what is the ultimate fate of the child? The end of the road for Providence is in sight. To witness the final chilling resolution, subscribe to the channel for the next chapter.
Constable Jeremiah Black stood over the body of Reverend Paris, the last vestige of civilization and order in Providence. The cold was no longer just in the air, it was in his soul. He had tried reason, he had tried containment, and he had failed. The child was a cancer, and the only way to deal with a cancer was to burn it out. He felt no rage, no holy fervor, only a cold, final determination. He dragged the Reverend's body to the meeting house and laid it inside. Then he gathered every scrap of lamp oil, pitch, and flammable material left in the abandoned village. He piled it around the Miller cabin. Caleb, the simpleton, watched him with wide, uncomprehending eyes, but followed his instructions, helping to stack wood against the sealed walls. When the pyre was ready, Black turned to Caleb. "You need to leave, son," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Go that way." He pointed down the trail that led to the settled lands. "Don't look back." Caleb, trusting the constable implicitly, nodded and shuffled off into the twilight. Black watched him until he disappeared. He was ensuring one person at least would carry the story out of this cursed place. Alone, Jeremiah Black stood before the sealed cabin. The scratching had begun again, soft and insistent. He took a torch, lit it from a small fire he had built, and walked the perimeter, touching the flame to the oil-soaked wood. The fire caught quickly, hungry after the long cold. Flames licked up the walls of the cabin, the dry timber groaning as it was consumed. He heard a new sound from inside, not a scream, not the crystal music, but a low, resonant hum, a vibration that he felt in his bones. The air around the cabin seemed to warp, the flames twisting in unnatural ways. He knew he had to look, he had to see it through. He walked to the front, where the fire had not yet fully taken hold, and peered through the slit the Reverend had made. The inside of the cabin was an inferno, and in the center of the flames stood the faceless child, untouched by the fire.
Its smooth head was turned toward him, and as the flames reached their peak, the hum intensified into a single, shattering note that seemed to break the world. In that moment, Jeremiah Black did not see emptiness. He saw a universe being born and dying in an instant, an infinite cycle of creation and destruction that rendered his own life, his own struggle, utterly meaningless. It was not a personal truth like the one that killed Paris, but an impersonal, cosmic one. He did not flinch. He accepted it. He had done his duty. He had ended the threat to his community, even if that community was gone. He stood his ground as the fire raged, and when the roof of the cabin collapsed in a shower of sparks, he was still standing there, his eyes open, a man who had stared into the heart of a star and had not been blinded, but had been granted a vision of the void that he carried with him into death. The faceless child was gone, consumed not by the fire, but by the finality of its own revealed truth. The horror of the faceless child has ended in a conflagration. Constable Black, the man of action, has faced the ultimate terror not with faith, but with duty. And in his final moment, he understood the scale of what he was destroying. The child is gone, but at what cost? The village of Providence is a burned-out ruin, its population scattered or dead. But is the story truly over? Can such a primordial force of emptiness ever be truly destroyed? The legacy of the faceless child is a stain on the land that time may not be able to erase. To understand the enduring echo of this tragedy, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the final chapter.